For most of human history, life was difficult. Not occasionally, constantly. You had to solve problems just to get through the day. You had to make decisions that mattered. You had to act because not acting had consequences. That environment didn't just challenge people, it calibrated them. It forced awareness. It forced attention. It forced movement. Now remove that. Remove the urgency. Remove the pressure. Remove the immediate consequences. What you get is not a better version of the human being. You get a version that can exist without needing to function. And most people don't realize it's happening to them because nothing is breaking. Nothing is failing immediately, but something is slipping. Pressure is not something to avoid. It is something that shapes you. It is what forces clarity when everything feels uncertain. It is what forces action when hesitation is easier. It is what forces growth when staying the same would be more comfortable. But more importantly, pressure removes options. And that is why it works. When something truly matters, you don't debate, you decide. You don't explore distractions, you eliminate them. You don't wait to feel ready. You move because you have to, not because you became more motivated, but because the situation closed every other door. For most of human history, that was the default environment. If you didn't produce, there were consequences. If you didn't adapt, you were replaced. If you didn't act, you lost ground immediately. There was no neutral state. You were either responding to reality or falling behind it. And that constant pressure created something specific. Not high performers, not perfect individuals, but people who were difficult to shut down. Now remove that structure. Replace it with comfort, convenience, predictability. At first, it feels like progress. And in many ways it is. But something else begins to shift underneath that surface. Because when pressure disappears, nothing replaces it automatically. There is no internal system that activates by default. You see, without pressure, your standards begin to drift. No, not all at once, and not dramatically, incrementally. You delay decisions because you can. You tolerate distractions because nothing interrupts you. You avoid difficulty because there is no cost for doing so. And over time, your references begin to change. What used to feel unacceptable now feels reasonable. What used to require effort now feels optional. What used to push you now feels excessive. And this is where most people misread the situation. They think they're becoming more relaxed, more balanced, more in control. But in reality, they've just lowered the standard required to feel okay. Because without structure, most people don't maintain standards. They adjust them downward to match their behavior. Now here's where it becomes a trap. Comfort doesn't present itself as a problem. It presents itself as alignment. It feels like things are finally working, like resistance is gone, like life is smoother. But that smoothness comes at a cost. Because the brain is efficient, it is not ambitious. It will always choose the path of least resistance, unless something forces it not to. So if the easier option is always available, and there is no consequence for choosing it, that becomes your baseline. Not occasionally, consistently. And consistency is what rewires behavior. So over time, something subtle happens. Effort starts to feel abnormal. Focus starts to feel heavy. Discomfort starts to feel unnecessary. And that is the trap. Because now the very things required for growth feels like problems to avoid. And that creates a widening gap between what you're capable of and what you're actually producing. You are still intelligent, still capable, still full of potential, but your output no longer reflects it. And that creates something deeper than frustration. It creates internal conflict. Because you know what you could be doing, and you watch yourself not doing it. Not because you can't, because nothing is forcing you to. So what works in an environment like this? You don't remove comfort. That's not realistic. But you control it. You reinduce pressure on purpose. Not randomly, not emotionally, but structurally. You create constraints where none exist naturally. Because constraints create focus. You define expectations that must be met regardless of how you feel, because feelings fluctuate, standards don't. You build systems that remove the options to drift, because drift is the default. If you rely on motivation, you will stall. If you rely on discipline alone, you will fatigue. But if you rely on structure, you will execute consistently. You set deadlines that matter. You create visible commitments. You track outcomes, not intentions. You define what done actually means. Because your brain does not respond to possibility. It responds to necessity. And if necessity does not exist, you must build it. This channel is not about removing difficulty. It is about understanding it and using it correctly. Because the future is not eliminating challenges. It is replacing the pressure that forces you to rise to them. And if you don't replace that pressure, you will drift. Quietly, gradually, without realizing it until it shows up in your results. If you want to stay sharp in a world that is getting softer, subscribe. I am D.B. Lewis. This is Post-Scarcity Human. I will see you in the next one.